is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and we wanted to cover on this show the whole monopolization of the railroads and the potential of a largest national railroad privately owned in the United States that is now being pushed through a merger, and that is with Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific. And this railroad will play an important role in the U.S. economy if the merger is successful. So we wanted to talk about that and what it means to working people and what it would mean to the economy of the United States. And joining us is Adam Barrington. He's with Public Rail Now and with the RW, Railroad Workers United, and also Fred Naiden, who is a professor of history, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having us.
So why don't we talk about this railroad merger? The head of Union Pacific apparently is very close to Trump, and they've fired one of the Democratic Party commissioners at disapproval. And in fact, he's been talking about where the military should be brought in. So we got somebody who's got a lot of power in the government. So Fred, why don't you talk about this merger and what it means, who's behind it?
This merger is the latest in a series of mergers since the Staggers Act deregulated the railroads. And at the same time, the courts took the view that there was no such thing as a railroad monopoly that would be illegal. As long as railroads could deliver efficiency or avoid price hikes, two financial tests, they would be obeying the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and the decades of law that followed those two original attempts to prevent monopolies. The railroads have always had a certain special, but perhaps a perverse place in this legal scheme. They've, to put it brutally, gotten away with more than other industries, partly because of the naturally monopolistic character of railroads. If I have a track, you can bet I've got 100 yards on either side of it. Out west, even in New York City, if I have a track, I've got 50 feet on either side of it. Where out in the outer boroughs where the big train yards are. So it's easy for a railroad to have, shall we say, a monopolistic bent or configuration. And as for the close connection to Trump, this is old stuff in railroad history. The most powerful men in the railroad business have always had presidents who would say, yes, sir.
And of course, the railroad to California, Continental Railroad, the railroads were given land. The railroads broke strikes of Chinese workers and other workers. They wanted slave labor.
And they got it, virtually, yes.
And their monopolization has led to rebellions. The North Dakota with the farmers and the railroads. I mean, it seems like they have quite a history in the United States of monopolization and using their monopoly power to control the government and also to basically rip off farmers and workers.
And just to add, the other dimension, to rip off passengers, including interstate passengers, commuter passengers, and for that matter, transit passengers. This too is a bloody business and a story of monopoly.
And one of the issues around the railroads is that the United States, unlike Europe, unlike Korea, Japan, China, doesn't have a real national passenger rail network. Is that because of the monopolization of the rail carriers?
In a word, yes.
Why don't you talk about that? Because people want to know, why don't we have mass transportation using bullet trains? In California, they've been trying for 30 years to get a train from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Hasn't happened. Yet in the rest of the world, you have mass transportation through passenger trains.
I think I'll turn the details of that case over to Adam, but it's worth saying in general that the private companies wanted to get out of passenger railroading, and they did. At first, there was a period in which they were obliged to provide some local railroading in their own home territory. So, for example, the Central Pacific had to provide some of the commuter service in the Bay Area. Then they escaped that obligation after the Staggers Act, and the governments had to pick up the pieces. And the governments, of course, aren't centralized, as you say. This California railroad shouldn't be California's business. It should be the business of the United States government. and back accordingly. In any European country, it would go from one end of the country to the other, except Russia. In Russia, you could take it halfway to Siberia. It's a massive project. And it's perverse that it's not a central government a business of the first order.
So, Adam, why don't you talk about this development? Because we want to have a modern train system, and we've fallen behind the rest of the world. And your organization, I think, is saying that in order to do that, we're going to have to look towards a public control of the railroad system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the United States is an anomaly around the world because we have a railroad system that's lock, stock, and barrel owned by private corporations. I mean, and, like we've kind of alluded to in this discussion already, they have unprecedented corporate power here. I mean, it's worth considering in talking about this merger, especially the antitrust immunity that the railroad corporations have. We, like Fred had mentioned, the Staggers Act and deregulation of the railroads. Well, the thought was the reason that there is this antitrust immunity was that, okay, well, we have something like the ICC that can regulate these corporations to such a degree that something like an antitrust law and enforcement of antitrust would not be necessary on the railroads, which was never sound logic to begin with. But after 1980, when they deregulated the railroads, that logic was especially challenged. And even though those regulations disappeared, that antitrust immunity remained. And I mean, the railroads from, right after the Civil War into the Gilded Age have had this concentrated corporate power because of the central position that the railroads have in the national economy. And we've seen these different clashes from 1877, 1886, 1894, all these major clashes that burst out between workers and the robber barons were rooted in the railroads.
In 1877, I mean, people don't know, there was a national railway strike, first national strike in the United States. The railroads there was a depression. They cut the wages of the railroad workers 20%. And in Pittsburgh, it meant that a railroad worker would take the train to one location. He didn't have the money to go back to where he was based. It led to a strike that went all the way to California, Oakland. It also led to the first commune in St. Louis, where people took over that city. Most people don't even know about that strike. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the senators in Missouri wanted Garfield to call in the army, and it turns out they had stock in the railroad company.
Yes, the railroad workers in the 19th century were not only the most militant large union, but they were the one union that could challenge the government as a whole, and did twice, the other occasion being the Pullman strike. Even on a lower level, a state level, the railroad workers had a unique power to shut down the economy of a city or a region. Subway strikes in New York have had this effect when they've occurred. And of course, in these strikes, you can count on it. When there's a railroad strike, the railroad union leader goes to jail. This too is a motif of railroad strikes.
And the laws against railroad strikes, it seems pretty extreme. The Railroad Labor Act, the battles that railroad workers have had for health and safety, the situation of railroad workers being punished to go to a doctor, and the whole contract that was imposed by Congress in the last struggle, where they didn't even have a sick day. I mean, what the hell is going on with the right of railroad workers to have decent working and living conditions? Adam?
Well, that's kind of like what we've been talking about here, is that we're dealing with this industry that is largely unregulated, doesn't have to worry about antitrust legislation or anything like that. Only has to depend on the Surface Transportation Board to do something like a merger. And so with that concentrated corporate power, we also have, this situation where the workers that are involved in this industry, again, that is so important to the national economy, that the government will step in. And I mean, in the case of 2022, it wasn't even a strike that was crushed. It was prevented. It was a preemptive move against a nationwide railroad strike. So you have these corporations that are able to say, we don't have to worry about regulation. We don't have to worry about any kind of like antitrust enforcement towards us. But we also have a state that's going to step in and discipline our workforce when we want them to. That's what we're dealing with.
And it seems these robber barons that run the railroads, they want to get bigger and bigger. Fred, what percentage of the railroad would be owned if there's merger goes through between Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific?
Well, roughly 40. Um, the big four are up to 90 among the four of them. And this is going to be roughly half of that. Why say roughly? Because one of the first things, of course, they will do once they merge is eliminate duplicated lines and eliminate some customers along with them because they're the less profitable customers. So we can ironically expect this merger to lead to some shrinking that will harm customers of the railroad.
And the mergers, there's supposed to be protection of users of the railroads, customers, and yet it seems like this has been completely ignored. Is that through deregulation or just ignoring the loss?
This is controversial. There's a surge of recent writing that some of which Adam pointed out to me. A famous piece, or at least a piece by a famous conservative writer, Posner, the professor at Chicago, arguing that the Congress has misunderstood the intent of the original basic laws, the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, which go back to the age of the robber barons, and has failed to prevent monopolization. And there's now a prospect, proving how right Posner is, that the other two in the big four will merge in response to this merger so that they will not be at a competitive disadvantage. You'll then have a big two controlling approximately or 80 or 90% of the rail freight business in this country. And then, of course, the next step is irresistible. There will be a big one. Because if four need to be two, the rationale works the same for two needing to be one. And this brings us to what I hope is the perversely happy ending. For once there is only one such firm, the American public will not stand for it. And the freight business will be nationalized, just as it has been already in other countries.
And let's talk about the record of U.S. railroad companies and the robber barons who run them, because the conditions of these lines, you have the East Palestine derailment, in which they blew up the company. Norfolk Southern blew up vinyl chloride. They ignored the calls by the company that had that vinyl chloride that it would be terrible for the residents and workers. They blew up these rail cars, contaminated thousands of people. Many of those residents and community members were not able to work because they got sick. The EPA denied that vinyl chloride was a danger to them. They didn't even let them know what it was. They got sick. They weren't able to work. And many of the residents now are sick and have lost their health care because they're not working, and they're in contaminated homes. And the
Yes,
railroad, Norfolk Southern, hasn't been forced to even take care of their health care benefits. They're still fighting the class agreements that they had, class action agreements, and don't cover their health care. And they
yes.
are not able to move out of contaminated homes. There's a thing called the Stafford Act, which was passed after Love Canal, that allows the government to institute as a mass incident casualty site this Stafford Act, which would allow them to get health care the rest of their lives, and also money to move out. Both Democrats and Republicans, Biden and the Republicans, refused to institute that. Vance went there on the second-year anniversary, and a lot of the reporters were asking, what can you do from the people for their health care? Because they were asking that. He said, I can't just snap my hands. Anyways, 2 years ago, we'll give some more money to the companies in the area. But it seems like the issue of derailments in the United States is a real, catastrophe. They're not getting better. The whole struggle, and maybe you can talk about it, to get rid of the engineers, to supposedly automate the trains using AI now. They want to get rid of the workers. Where does that leave the people in these communities, workers in this country, and the public?
One thing to be said about East Palestine in particular is that your listeners shouldn't be deceived by the fact that this took place in shall we say, a rural or even an isolated area. That's misleading. This is only an hour's drive from Pittsburgh, and that line that carried that poison up from Houston across the Middle West was heading for Pennsylvania, There was already been a major incident some years ago that was less harmful than this, at a town called, I think, Brockington, Pennsylvania. And sooner or later, this won't happen to a town of 5,000. This will happen in Toledo, or this will happen in Baltimore. And the damage will be far greater.
And it seems that, Adam, that basically they're getting away with this. There are thousands of derailments. I mean, every day, and nothing happens. None of the CEO goes to jail. I know in Japan, if they have one real serious rail incident, a lot of these executives are actually prosecuted criminally. Yet in the United States, it seems these criminal activities of not having enough maintenance, of contaminating people, poisoning people, it's okay in the United States. Poison the people, poison the working people, poison the residents, and workers, railroad workers themselves that got sick as a result of these contaminations. Radioactive materials carried on the train. It seems like the wild, wild west. Is that what we've got here?
100%. I mean, I'm glad Fred had mentioned it, and you have as well. I mean, what happened in East Palestine was absolutely catastrophic. What people don't know is that derailments happen all the time. You know, that one got a lot of publicity, but these things happen way more often than people would like to think. And what we have is this cult of the operating ratio on the railroads, where they do whatever they can to cut as much as possible to increase short-term profits as much as possible, which is why we have these massive trains that are heavier and heavier, which is completely unsafe. We have them cutting maintenance, cutting down the amount of time that people have to actually inspect the cars and make sure that they're safe. It's gutting the railroad workforce even more than it has already been gutted. I mean, we know they're trying to move to single-person crews, and even as you mentioned with automation, maybe down to having automated locomotives, as a matter of fact. So they don't care about the safety and well-being of workers or trackside communities or anybody. It's again this cult of the operating ratio. Get rid of as much as possible, run on bare bones so we can increase our profit margin as much as we can, as soon as we can.
And some of these agencies, National Transportation Safety Board, I know that they did a report about that accident, that wreck in East Palestine. They didn't examine even the braking issue, why they didn't put the brakes on the train. And it turns out that the policy of the company was to use dynamic braking rather than air braking, because you would save money on brake pads. I mean, it seems insane to with the cost of that. And I heard Norfolk Southern has actually a contingent of workers that go from town to town after derailments. This is like part of the business. I mean, it sounds like crazy that they would spend money on a business of cleaning up, and then the workers get contaminated as well at these derailment sites. It sounds like it's one big train wreck in this country.
And the accident, the public should be reminded, was fundamentally simple. It was having a small fire occurring in a wheel. This can happen in your car. If you don't take care to change the oil, it will happen in your car. And this, in spite of the many complications, is the heart of the matter. Simple common sense and quite pedestrian precautions weren't taken. And when the train was that long, it took far too long to find the problem. It took hours to find it and deal with it, and by then it was too late.
And the owner of, or the CEO of Union Pacific, what's his relationship with Trump? Because it seems like Trump parties with him a lot, and he's advising Trump not only probably for the merger, but also where military troops should be sent, St. Louis and other. What is going on with that? I mean, it sounds like the robber barons are now telling the president openly where you should put military troops and occupations.
Well, in the light of what you mentioned before, you should smile less and merely frown, because of course they've been doing this for centuries. I mean, in the heydays of their lawlessness, they wouldn't wait for the president or the governor to send the troops. Jay Gould hired spies and Pinkertons, detectives, and used these private armies to open fire on his own employees. No, this is routine for them.
Yeah, this is tale as old as time. I mean, yeah, I mean, we can look at even the political power that they have in, I mean, like was mentioned earlier with the firing of Robert Primus. It's worth noting that he was the only STB member who voted against the 2023 CPKC merger. So we can see what's going on. I mean, I was born at night, but not last night.
And it seems like Democrat or Republican, both parties really are not doing anything about oversight and regulation. I mean, even when Biden was in, the residents of East Palestine tried to get him to institute the Stafford Act. There's a bill that was introduced, which supposedly the senators in that region wanted to regulate the railroads so there'd be less derailments. What's happened with that legislation? It seems like it's disappeared. It's gone by the wayside.
I don't know the fate of it. However,
It's disappeared.
it's a sad, the sad headline, of course, is that the senator who was leading that effort, Sherrod Brown, is no longer in the Senate.
Yeah, now we've got Bernie Moreno, who says he would like to get the government out of even Amtrak, a pro-privatization zealot. So tragic.
So this deregulation, let the robber barons run things. The market will take care of it. It seems like the result in the railroads has been catastrophic for people in this country.
Absolutely.
Yes, it's bad news, but not very bad news that in Europe at this point, some of the railroads that were nationalized and are still controlled by the government are hiring private companies, but only to operate the roads, not to be in charge of the entire enterprise, but just to provide crews. This shouldn't be taken as Europe backing away from public control of railroads. It's an attempt to save a certain amount of money on operating costs only, on crew costs mainly.
And the
And it's had mixed results.
and the privatization of the railways in the United Kingdom, what has that led to?
It led to more crowding, more late trains, although the safety record was still much better than ours. And then, of course, when Labor came in, Starmer proposed to eliminate it. He set a deadline sometime in the future. It isn't clear whether he'll go through with it. But in Scotland, they went through with it straight away. The two systems, of course, being integrated. So when you get on board a train in Scotland, as I did some months ago, it's a perfectly public operation. The workers seemed quite contented. I asked them about the problem that the English were having, and they just nodded. Starmer is not their notion of an effective leader. They like to think that they carried out Starmer's plan, and Starmer has failed too.
So it's actually, for a lot of people in the United Kingdom, they've wrecked the train system. It used to be efficient.
Yes, it's not what it was, say 20 or 30 years ago.
But they do have a railroad system for passengers. Here in this country, we don't even have that.
Yes, and the trains are crowded in the United Kingdom. It's not as though they're suffering for lack of passengers.
And it's a more efficient way of moving people, and environmentally, it's better. So, Adam, why don't you talk about your campaign, Public Rail Now? What is it? How is it going to come about? And what people can do in this country to support public control of the railroad, so they're not under the control of robber barons who basically don't care that their trains are killing people, wrecking communities, and causing derailments, and the fact they're preventing really a real national transportation rail system for passengers.
Sure. So Public Rail Now is something of a campaign, something of a coalition of folks that are involved in labor, environmental justice, various other grassroots movements, all coming together to demand public ownership and operation of the U.S. rail system. Like I said earlier, the U.S. rail system is a complete anomaly. I mean, in all of these things that we see from the rail system that we have under private control, the fact that the robber barons never went away, they just, changed their suits and ties. All of this can only be addressed by public ownership. And when we say public ownership, we are speaking to the democratization of the industry, bringing in workers and their unions, trackside communities, farmers, the people that depend on the rail system in this country, actually having a direct say in how it's operated, what it's prioritized. And is in terms of how we're going to accomplish that, I mean, that's a tall order. especially given the political situation in this country today. But I would say, in short, that just like any other massive gain that has been made by working people all over the world, is going to take a mass popular movement, with people getting involved, taking to the street, and making our voices heard. And we're still building. We're still a relatively young campaign, a young coalition, but there's absolutely an appetite for this. I mean, it would be a boon to the working class, especially folks that are working on the railroads, folks in trackside communities. And if we look at something like catenary electrification, for example, something that the class one carriers are completely allergic to, they don't like capital expenditure in any form. So the idea of electrifying the whole rail system that will never happen under private ownership. All of these things can only be addressed fully with taking the power from the robber barons and creating a rail system that operates with the people in mind and prioritizes the public over profit. We have a website, publicrailnow.org, that folks can go to sign up. We have monthly meetings. And yeah, with this merger situation, we're going to be directing a lot of attention towards this and expressing why we're facing a private monopoly. There isn't an alternative. Any idea that we're going to just break these rail companies up and just have a bunch of small private carriers is asinine. The only other option we have is a national rail system.
And one of the things that I think people are unhappy about is that these other countries have serious advanced rail systems, bullet trains. China has developed a massive rail system, bullet trains throughout the country. They're using solar power for some of the trains. This country seems like thousands of years behind. And what it sounds from what you're saying, as long as it's under private control, it's not going to happen. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. So long as profit is prioritized, there's no reason for them to. And it's funny. Recently, I think a couple of months ago, Elon Musk was bashing the U.S. rail system, bashing Amtrak, and said we need to privatize everything. But then in the same breath, he was saying how great China's trains are. So that's completely schizophrenic perspective coming from Elon Musk, that praising privatization while also praising a state-run railroad in China. But I firmly believe, and I think most folks would agree, given the facts, so long as these robber barons control the rail system, there's no incentive for them to do what's in the best interest of the public.
And the fact that they control the Congress and they give money both to the Democrats and Republicans, has any senator, any congressperson called for public control of the railroads?
Not. I'm sure Sanders has said it at some point in his valuable career, but I think you're essentially right. He doesn't make it a top issue. He had it's on his list, but no, not at the top.
You would think after something like Norfolk Southern's wreck of East Palestine that people would be saying these railroads are out of control, they're not being held accountable, and it's not one railroad. All these railroads are having the same practices, cutting workers, not doing proper health and safety, and basically violating protection of working people and residents in this country.
Yeah. There's another certain feature that's new that should be mentioned. It's only with the merger that started with the Canadian Pacific and the Kansas City that we now have one railroad that has most of the rest of that 10 or 20% that operates in Canada and the United States and in Mexico, and it has an important lane, so to speak, to itself running through the center of the country. And if there is to be effective national control here, it'll have to be done in cooperation with these two companies, one Mexican, although now American controlled, and the other Canadian. And it'll involve cooperation, therefore, among the three governments. And this is all to the good. It will create a spirit of cooperation concerning a basic industry. It will be anathema to Donald Trump if he's still somewhere cogitating, at least, if not past that. The centralization of the railroads, to put it another way, has a positive side, and it's linking Canada and Mexico and the United States in the operation of this industry. That will be very good for Mexican workers, and it'll be good for our workers too.
Well, where are the unions on this? Because I know some of the unions have already agreed to this merger, SMART,
Yeah.
and they say that their members are going to be protected. Uh, if there is a merger, their jobs might be protected, but they may move from place to place. There's no real protection of keeping where they're at, their seniority. Yet, have any of the national railway unions said that it's time for public control of the railroads?
No.
Not at this time, but to the credit of the Transport Workers Union, they came out swinging against this merger. Smart TD initially did as well, but like you said, they've unfortunately backpedaled and said that they will support it so long as jobs are protected. Other rail unions, to my knowledge, have sort of taken a wait and see approach, though unfortunately the incentive for union leadership in a situation like this is nobody wants to be left with the short end of the stick. So the fear is if all these other labor organizations are agreeing to this thing, but we're the last holdout, then we might get screwed. But like we were talking about East Palestine earlier, the president of TWU, John Samuelson, I think he deserves a lot of praise for pointing out that something like East Palestine, when we're looking at a mammoth merger like this, those things that like East Palestine are going to become more and more common. The chances of that happening become greater and greater. And, as we're seeing, like we've mentioned, Union Pacific CEO's relationship with Trump, we've seen how the government will operate actually to protect the interests of the railroads. It's increasing the power of these corporations in Washington, and that's also going to impact their power in negotiations with their workers. And I think a really good example is, we can see in 1996 what happened when Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Rail merged and became BNSF. They had these different contracts for their workers, but the benefits in those contracts were eliminated with the merger if they weren't included in both, or they would just pick the lesser of the benefits and adopt it for the entire merged workforce. It's a massive attack on workers. So, I mean, I can understand in some way the nervousness of union leaderships to come out against this in a really powerful way, although it would be in the best interest of the workers if they did. But it's faced with this massive corporate power that has control over the political instruments. A lot of them are nervous. They're also so separated by craft. There's 12, 13 rail unions, and they don't have really any kind of concrete structure for coordinated bargaining or taking action together as a united industrial force. So a lot of them are kind of sitting nervous, waiting to see what happens. But it's going to be catastrophic for workers if the unions don't come together and take action on this.
And I mean, it sounds like business unionism, just working for yourself, screw everybody else. And that's led to a decline in working conditions, a decline of worker rights. Eugene Debs, we haven't mentioned his name, but he's one of the leaders of the American labor movement in history, set up the American Railway Workers Union. It sounded like he had a different plan for railroad workers in this country. What was his vision for railroad workers in this country?
One big union.
That's right. And not a federal union, but a centrally organized union. Not a mere minimal form of organized unity, such as the brotherhoods have sometimes talked about. Certain contracts are dealt with by several unions in concert. Debs wanted a truly centralized, unified, nationwide organization.
And I think the bosses and the robber barons would be afraid of that.
Yeah, indeed, this is one of the reasons. Yeah, Debs didn't go to jail just because he talked a little pacifism during World War I. His far more dangerous talk concerned industrial organization of workers.
And what do workers think about that? Because their conditions are going down. They have a union leadership that are business unionists, are not unifying them. Railroad Workers United, isn't that one of the reasons it was formed? To try to unify all railroad workers? Adam?
Yes,
yeah, so I mean, the railroad workers who I've talked to think it makes total sense. Why aren't we all in one industrial union? It doesn't make sense that we are essentially not only fighting the bosses, but in competition with one another. It is totally backwards. Railroad Workers United is, I mean, it's an important force in the industry because even though it's not a union, it is something of a caucus, a progressive caucus of railroad workers across all the crafts fighting for a sort of coordinated, united effort on the railroads. And I mean, the response from a lot of the union leadership, unfortunately, towards RWU is somewhat hostile. You know, they think RWU is trying to do some dual unionist conspiracy against them to take their power when RWU's whole purpose is trying to make the unions more powerful and trying to unite railroad workers across all the crafts. And I think this merger, with what it's going to do to the workers, I mean, one of the things that I've talked with some railroad workers about, just the very fact that with this merger, they will be able to make railroad workers choose between remaining in their community and having a job. If they move a terminal and they say, hey, now you're across the country, time to pack up your family and move, it's absolutely devastating to the already majorly disrupted lives of these railroad workers. And so we're going to see job loss. We're going to see plant consolidation. It's going to be, again, corporate and political power concentrated in somewhat unprecedented ways. It's going to be a disaster for everybody but the shareholders, which we should probably note. I just read earlier today, close to 100% of the shareholders from Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific love the merger. It's like 99%, 99.5% from both the corporations saying, yes, we love this thing. It'll be great for them. It's going to be a disaster for everybody else.
The other thing to be said is about the problem of organizing the workers is that in the subway business, this has already happened. In Chicago, the original trolley car union now represents everyone in Chicago rail transit. And there are thousands of employees there. This is not a small operation. Similarly, in New York, a different union, the transport workers, represents every craft. And there are thousands of men driving those trains, thousands more repairing them, and so on. These are good-sized companies by today's railroad standard, with total employment in the thousands or tens of thousands. And they're well, shall we say, well tamed by these unions because the unions have the capacity to act as one and shut these systems down. The lesson is there, and it's been there for these interstate freight unions to learn. They've had a century to learn it, and they are slow learners.
Okay, well, I want to thank both of you for talking with us today. We've been talking with Fred Naiden. He's a professor of history, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in history, and Adam Barrington. He's with Public Rail Now, and they're talking about this merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek.
Thanks for having us.